This episode is sponsored by National Geographic's Barkskins. Barkskins is a new limited series that takes place in New France, which is present-day Quebec in the 17th century. It premieres on National Geographic May 25th. The show follows the settlers and their struggles, where it's always the survival of the fittest. In this era, for both preservation and flavor, food was often smoked over an open fire. That sounded a little labor-intensive, though, especially since the majority of us have a thing with a propane tank in our backyard. But with a few simple tweaks, you too can enjoy one of the first distinct cuisines of the Americas using only the humble gas grill. Let's get down to basics. Alright, so folks, this is not your typical episode of Basics with Babish, this is Backyard with Babish, where today we're going to be exploring how to smoke on a gas grill. Barbecue purists will tell you that's punishable by law, but at the end of the day, if you give them a rack of smoky, flavorful, juicy ribs and they're still complaining, just don't invite them over next time. Now, you can smoke all kinds of stuff using this method, but as an example, we're going to go with ribs. And for ribs and most other barbecue, we need a spice rub. So my favorite baseline spice rub starts with about a half cup of sweet paprika, maybe about a tablespoon of smoked paprika if you want to juke the smoke stats, but hopefully we won't need that. About a half cup of dark brown sugar, maybe 2 or 3 tablespoons of chili powder, and a hefty sprinkling or about a tablespoon each of ground ginger, garlic powder, and onion powder. And then we start getting into the optional stuff. How about a teaspoon or 2 of ground sage? This, along with a teaspoon or 2 of dried oregano, can bring some nice herbiness to the party. How about a teaspoon of ground mustard seed? It's going to bring a little tang, a little acidity. And a half teaspoon, maybe a full teaspoon of ground cayenne if you want a little heat. Decidedly not optional is a solid tablespoon of ground pepper, preferably freshly ground, but forgive me. And a tablespoon of kosher salt. Oh, that's way too much. Let's just shake out about a tablespoon of that and then try to get the rest back into the box here. I don't want to spill any salt. That's bad luck. That's not working. Excuse me while I go inside and very carefully drop this into a bowl. And there you have it, all the building blocks of a very basic Memphis dry rub. A dry rub is not only necessary to build flavor, but over time to develop the prized bark that develops on the outside of smoked meat. Once it's all mixed together and homogeneous, now's the time to give it a taste in the most efficient way possible by throwing it upwards in the air and catching it with your tongue and adjusting as necessary. What does it need? How's the balance between sweet and salty and savory? Rubs, sauces, and smokers alike are all subjects of heated contention, so there's no exact formula here. This is an opportunity to build flavors and develop your own style. Once you've got your rub in a place where you like it, it's time to make good on its name and give it a rub down on some ribs. Specifically of the baby back variety, these are some of the quicker cooking and more forgiving ribs that you can find. But we can't just rub them down and call it a day. First, we have to remove a papery membrane from underneath the ribs. This is best done by finding the edge of the membrane using a paring knife and then using a paper towel to grip, peeling it off in one smooth, unusually satisfying motion. Be sure not to skip this step. This membrane prevents fat from rendering out of the ribs, and no matter how long you cook it for, it will remain chewy and inedible. So once that's removed, your racks are ready to rock. But before they head over to the heat, we need to rub them down with our rub. Set aside about a half a cup of your rub for later use, and sprinkle the rest generously all over every square inch of your ribs. Just sort of pat it down and spread it out as you go to make sure that it's absorbing the little bit of moisture on the outside of your ribs, and make sure that no single solitary square inch goes uncovered, top, bottom, and sides. Right now is quite simply not the time to be bashful about rubbing. Once every facet of your racks have been stained in an even coat of crimson, we're going to let these guys sit out at room temperature for about an hour. This is going to help a sort of crust form on the outside of your ribs, which will make for a stronger bark later on. So while these guys sit out, we can discuss how we're going to convert our gas grill into a smoker. Now, gas grills are a far cry from an ideal smoking setup. There's no wood for starters, but it's also full of vents through which smoke can escape, and the burning of propane creates a very dry cooking environment. So we're going to offset those a couple different ways. First up, the lack of wood. We're going to cut ourselves a length of aluminum foil and on one side pile a few handfuls of small wood chips for smoking. You can go with anything from apple to pecan to cherry to mesquite. I'm going with hickory. We're then going to fold that foil onto itself and crimp the edges to make a little foil packet of wood chips. And if you like, you can make 3 or 4 of these ahead of time, because you're probably going to go through one every hour and a half or so. Once that's all crimped into a pretty little package, we're going to cut 4 or 5 vents into the top so smoke can't escape. This guy is then headed directly on top of the heat plates that sit right above your actual burners. We want it as close to the heat source as possible so the wood begins to smolder and, you guessed it, smoke. You'll also notice that we're placing it on the far right side of the grill. This is so we can have all of our heat localized on the right side of the grill and place our ribs on the left side of the grill, creating a barbecue essential known as indirect heat. Next up, we're going to compensate for the very dry cooking environment furnished by a propane grill by placing a couple disposable aluminum pans right over the wood chips and filling them halfway with good old-fashioned tap water. Now, you could use apple juice or beer, but either way, these guys are going to simmer and introduce some much-needed steam into the situation. Now we're going to crank our rightmost burners over high heat, remove this kind of bun warmer rack. We've already got smoking hot buns. Close this guy up and wait for your improvised smoker to start, well, smoking. Now we don't want the wood chips to burn too hot or too fast, so once they start smoking like this, we're going to turn the heat down to medium in an effort to both slow combustion and maintain a grill temperature between 225 and 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the smoke production sort of slows down a little bit and ideally turns from white to blue, it's time to introduce our ribs to the situation. For this, you can optionally use a rib rack. This is going to help the ribs cook a little bit more evenly. So I'm just going to slice these guys in half and dab the cut end and rub to make sure that we're totally covered, and start to stand the ribs up vertically on the left side of the grill away from the heat. In fact, we want the ribs as far away from the heat as possible without touching the wall of the grill. Also, we want the ribs oriented like this, perpendicular to the heat, so they're getting even exposure. Then we're going to close the lid, and from this point on, make every effort to open it as seldomly as possible, making slight adjustments to the burner as necessary to maintain that temperature of 225 to 275. Now, ideally, you want to use an ambient temperature probe for this, not the built-in gauge on the grill. But if you got to use the gauge, it's not the end of the world. It's just not going to give you as good results. So just peek out the window every 15-20 minutes, make sure that the temperature hasn't ventured too far outside that range, and make minor adjustments as necessary. Now, after an hour, you're going to notice that you're not producing nearly as much smoke. The first thing we're going to do to remedy that is simply rotate the wood packet so it gets a little bit more varied exposure to the heat. This is probably going to buy you an extra half hour of smoke tops, but eventually your fuel is going to run out and you're going to have to feed the beast. So simply get that smoking hot bag of wood chips out of the way and drop in a fresh one. You did make those ahead of time, didn't you? You didn't? Well, they take like 10 seconds to make, so no big deal. Once the packet is replaced, the smoke initiation procedure is very much the same. Crank these guys over high heat for about 5-6 minutes until thick white smoke begins to billow out of your grill. Now, more smoke does not necessarily equal better, so for both the ribs' flavor and tenderness, we need to exercise temperature control. If you're seeing tons of thick white smoke like this, your fire is too hot. Turn down the flame. Once you see this, the thin, sacred blue smoke, that's when you've hit the sweet spot. Now all there's left to do is maintain this smoke and the ambient temperature for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours, replacing your wood packet 3 or 4 times depending on how much smoke flavor you want to get. There is no possible way to prescribe cook time for anything when you're smoking. It's going to depend entirely on what you're smoking, what kind of meat it is, how thick it is, how much connective tissue there is, how hot your grill is, how well you've maintained the temperature. 1,000,001 mitigating factors all dancing together in a delicate ballet known as barbecue. Just try to maintain the environment as best you can, refill the water pans as necessary, and turn your ribs 180 degrees every 90 minutes or so to make sure that they're getting even exposure to the heat. Throughout this process, we've got plenty of time to make a barbecue sauce. Another hotly contested and wildly regionalized aspect of barbecue, the sweet, sour, and sticky substance that most of us are accustomed to, is Kansas City-style barbecue sauce. This starts with a small 14-ounce bottle of ketchup, and here we go, I'm going to try to say it correctly, a 1/4 cup of Worcestershire sauce. Did I do it right? I had to Google how to say it first. 1 or 2 tablespoons of classic ballpark yellow mustard, a little squeeze or a few dashes of your favorite hot sauce, and you could use garlic powder and onion powder, but I like to grate 2 small cloves of garlic and about 1/4 of a red onion directly into the sauce for a little extra texture and flavor. And then we got to balance out all this sour and savory with some sweet, usually taking the form of about 1/2 cup of dark brown sugar. Hi. Go ahead and say hello for the first time to your new neighbors. Add the brown sugar as well as a few generous dashes of your barbecue rub. Regular size whisk all these guys together, and then just like the barbecue rub, give it a taste. What does it need? Is it too sour? Is it too sweet? Mine is a little bit too sour, so I'm going to offset that with some blackstrap molasses. Also, I want some more warmth and spice from my barbecue rub, so I'm going to toss a little bit more of that in there. Once it is perfectly balanced, as all things should be, it's time to cover it and let it simmer over medium-low heat for about 10 minutes to let all those flavors get to know each other. Meanwhile, my ribs are at about the 5-hour mark and they're looking pretty good. We want them to hit about 200 degrees Fahrenheit at their thickest point, and when stretched, we want the meat to slightly separate and the bones to feel a little loosey-goosey. That means that these guys are ready to finish, so I'm going to remove them from the rack and place them directly on the grill grate, still on the cool side of the grill. Then I'm going to hit them with a generous shellac of our homemade barbecue sauce. We want this to form the ultra-sticky, caramelized layer that forms on the outside of ribs. To make this happen, we got to close up the grill and crank those far burners as high as they'll go until the ambient temperature of the grill reaches about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. This is going to give our barbecue that stick to your ribs and your fingers and your teeth kind of extra credit. Once that layer is soft and sticky but not fully hardened, it's time to take these guys off the grill. Let them rest for about 10 minutes, give them one last brush down with sauce, and there you have it, some almost fully legit barbecue off a gas grill. I'm sure I'm going to catch hell for saying that, but if all you got is a gas grill in your backyard, this is the closest you can get to the real thing. You can even see that we've achieved a light pink smoke ring around the outside perimeter of the meat. And when subjected to the squeeze it so all the juices come out test, they pass with flying colors because these ribs received the slow and low treatment they so dearly desire. And now I get to receive the ribs I so dearly desire. I hope you guys give this one a try for yourselves. It's a lot less intimidating and you're in a lot more control than you might imagine. So this Memorial Day, try your hand at some barbecue and try a new series about the birth of the Americas. Thank you again to National Geographic's Barkskins for sponsoring this episode. Barkskins is a new limited series on National Geographic based on a New York Times bestselling novel. It follows a disparate group of outcasts and dreamers battling to escape their pasts while navigating brutal frontier hardships in the New World. This Memorial Day, channel your inner 17th century settler and fire up some meat or veggies. And be sure to check out the premiere of Barkskins on National Geographic on May 25th.